Hello. Today I'm going to tell you guys the story of this American helmet that was found in southern France. And more importantly, I'm going to tell you all the story about the 65th Infantry Regiment and their Colonel George A. Ford that I managed to find out after investigating the story of this helmet. So the helmet was found by a local resident in the French Alps, and he told me he had found it in the fork of a tree in a steep ravine near the village of Peira Cava, which is in the mountains near Nice. See, this is a map of southern France. You have the Mediterranean Sea. This is Nice, and the Peira Cava area is here where the star is. And you'll notice it's at the Italian border, the border between Italy and France. And that's because in August 1944 there was an invasion here, west of Nice, and the Allied troops liberated the area. But then it was decided that they wouldn't try to cross through the mountains into Italy. So then there was static warfare going on at the border during several months until almost the very end of the war. So this is what the helmet looks like. It's still in pretty good condition because it was not buried. In the mountains, things usually, lie on rocks and stuff. And in this case, it was actually in the fork of a tree. Like I said, it probably rolled down a hill and then landed in the tree. And the first thing you notice is that the helmet has remains of camouflage paint. You see, it has a black line painted here. There seems to be some yellow, then some green. Of course, it's rusty, so you can't see it too nicely, but it is a camouflaged helmet. And like I said, it was found in Peira Cava, which is a village where the 517th and 509th Parachute Infantry were active for a couple of months. And the 509th and 517th had jumped into southern France for the invasion, and they had been camouflaged with spray paint, their uniforms, their helmet, all their things, so they looked like this, basically. And if you want to know more details about that, I made a video explaining the whole story in the Marvin Moles video, so you can watch that if you're more interested. So because the 517th and 509th had camouflaged items, I made the assumption that this helmet, found in an area where the paratroopers were involved and also camouflaged, must belong either to the 517th or to the 509th. But there is a little but. You see, if you look closely at the front of the helmet, it has an insignia carved into it, a Malta cross, and I had no idea what that meant. I figured it must be, something that had a personal meaning to one of the paratroopers. And if you look very closely under the Malta cross, it kind of looks like there might be a number carved here. To me, it looked like 69, but I'm not totally sure about that. It could just be the rust. Anyways, I ended up asking on an internet forum if anybody knew what this Malta cross was on my paratrooper helmet. And one guy answered and he said, I really like the helmet, but I'm 99.9% sure it's not paratrooper. And he said that he thinks the insignia on the front of the helmet is for the 65th Infantry Regiment. So I was slightly disappointed because, of course, paratrooper things are usually more interesting. And plus, I had absolutely never heard of any 65th Infantry Regiment, but I looked it up, and sure enough, I found out that there was a 65th Infantry Regiment that existed. It consisted of Puerto Rican soldiers, most of them who only spoke Spanish, and the unit's insignia is a Malta cross. And you see, if you compare to the helmet, well, yeah, that's pretty convincing. The unit number is 65, and on the helmet I thought I could see a 69 carved, but actually it might be 65. And when I was doing this research in 2005, the Wikipedia page said that in September 1944, the 65th Infantry landed in southern France and was committed to action at Peira Cava. So yeah, it's a perfect match. The helmet was found at Peira Cava. It has the insignia on the front, so now I'm convinced. The helmet is not a paratrooper helmet. It is a helmet that belonged to a soldier of the 65th Infantry, and that he must have lost in 1944-45 when the unit was down there. Now, at the time, there was almost no information about the unit on Wikipedia, but another thing that it said on the internet was that the commanding officer of the 65th Infantry Regiment had been reported missing in action in the Peira Cava area. Now, if you've watched a few of my videos, you know that when I find out somebody is missing in action, well, that's kind of like waving a red flag in front of a bull, right? That gets me excited, and I want to solve the case. So I looked into this 65th Infantry Regiment and this story of their commanding officer going missing, and now I'm going to show you the results of my investigation. So we're going to start by taking a look at the Peira Cava area from the air. So you see it's a mountainous region. Peira Cava is down here. And the unit positions at the time, the front lines were like this. You had basically the mountain range has the shape of a U. And on the eastern side, the Germans were in position. And on the western side, the Germans were in position. The Americans were also down in the valley. And they were also in position at the southern end of the Germans' mountain range. And the units that were present, so as we said, the 65th, the 3rd Battalion only of the 65th Infantry Regiment was in the Peira Cava area. The other 2 battalions were somewhere else in France and were not involved. And then here in the southern part at Moulinet, there was also the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in place. So you may have heard of the Nisei, the Japanese American soldiers during World War II. And this was them. So it was, I think, the most decorated unit of the US Army. They had been fighting in Italy and stuff like that before being posted here in southern France. And then when it comes to the Germans, the unit holding the mountains here was the 107th Infantry Regiment of the 34th Infantry Division. And this was a unit that had spent years on the Eastern Front, and they didn't mess around. They were highly experienced German troops. Now this is what the area actually looks like in reality. You see you have this big valley in the middle, and the Americans were on the western side, and the Germans on the eastern side. And this is what the American lines look like from the German point of view. So Peira Cava is this area here. It's about 1,500 meters above sea level. And then this is what the German lines look like from the American point of view. You can see the terrain is very difficult, and in some of the areas it's completely impassable. This is the German positions. This is also the German positions, and then the Americans facing them. So you can see that this terrain is an extremely unhospitable area and not a fun place to be fighting a war. And like I said, the war that was going on here was static warfare. Nobody was planning to advance. So it was basically just sitting around observing each other, artillery fire, and then making patrols, and guys often getting wounded by stepping on mines, usually their own mines, actually. So now let's get into Colonel Ford. Colonel Ford was an American officer, a West Pointer, and he was 42 years old in 1944. And as far as I've been able to determine, he had never been in combat, and he was not an experienced infantry officer. And previously, during the war, before being sent to Peira Cava, you can see that here, from June 1944 until November, he had been chief transportation. He had been the chief of transportation. And all of a sudden, in December 1944, he's transferred to the 65th Puerto Rican Infantry Regiment in Peira Cava. And we can know what he thought about that because he wrote a letter home to his wife. And this is what he says. I arrived at my command post yesterday afternoon. I found it in a tiny hamlet 5,000 feet up in the Maritime Alps. It is a jewel of a setting, the most gorgeously magnificent scenery I have ever encountered. It is futile to attempt to describe it. A tumbled sea of mountains all around, rugged gray masses dusted with snow, and snow-covered ranges interspersed. So those are kind of like the pictures I just showed you. And he continues the letter. I'm so darned happy over the situation that I am likely to burst into song at any moment. My surroundings are such that it is a shame to take the taxpayers' money for being here. I have my own command again and in a combat zone, doing work that I love and can be enthusiastic over again, and with a unit which appears basically excellent but in need of lots of work. It is just perfect, or would be if you were here too. Short of that, I've been so very lucky, and after the last miserable 6 months too, that I can hardly keep down to earth, nor need you have the least concern over my safety. It is a nice quiet little war we have here, and my only risk is of bumping my head against a cloud. A merry, merry Christmas to the best and sweetest wife and family ever. I shall be thinking of you even more than usual, and as always, sending all my love. So this letter was written on December 15th, 1944. And if we read through the lines and look at the situation, what we actually see is that Colonel Ford, so a person with no combat experience, is being transferred to a non-English speaking infantry unit that he has no experience with. He's never seen them before. And he's transferred to them on the very day that they are sent to the front lines. So that's kind of strange. Usually units are supposed to be, trained together, the officers, the men, before being sent to combat. And this guy is parachuted into the unit exactly as they're sent to the front lines, and despite the fact that he himself does not have any combat experience. About the unit, he says it's excellent, but he also says it's in need of lots of work, so you can wonder what he means by that. And last thing, the guy, he's being sent to a war zone, and it's interesting, actually, in his letter, he's just totally happy about this, He's probably been waiting his whole life to be sent to combat, and now he finally is in a combat area. So let's see now what happens to the unit. This is the unit radio log, so all the communications are written down. And you can see, so December 13th, the unit arrives in Peira Cava area. All units in position and relieving units of the 442nd. So the Japanese American soldiers had been there before, and now the 65th is taking over. So that's December 13th. And December 14th, first day on the lines, Colonel George A. Ford arrived to the command post and assumed command of the regiment. So I was reading through these pages, and it's just, the daily activities. It says we have a patrol out here, a patrol out there, Germans bombed this area, bombed that area. And as I read through the pages, what I see puts me in a state of, let's say, complete disbelief. I've never seen something like this before in an American unit diary. So it starts on December 19th, 1944 at 18:35. It says, Private Luis accidentally shot his toe, left foot, in a dugout. So that's kind of, it can be an accident, and but it also looks like it could be a self-inflicted wound, whatever. There's just one case, right? But then I keep on reading. December 19th at 18:30. Private First Class Felix shot his arm when he slipped on ice at 18:30. So this is getting a bit suspicious. Then December 21st, 1835. Private Raphael shot his right arm with a pistol accidentally. 22nd December at 0:25. One member of the Guard Reserve accidentally discharged his rifle and injured his right hand. Then, just afterwards, 1:45, Private Gustavo, while posting the guard, accidentally discharged his rifle and shot his left hand. So 2 guys shoot themselves in the hand within 1 hour. 23 December at 22:33. So there's a situation where they say Company Al, two men from Company Al were on guard when they saw a man running through the woods in the direction of the command post. They threw hand grenades at the man. At the same time, other men up the hill started throwing grenades. Private First Class Alejo stepped out of the dugout and was caught by a grenade thrown by men up the hill. Private First Class Alejo lost his hand. So this guy had a grenade blew up near him and it ripped off his hand. A bit strange. And then a bit later, the medical team send a message. They say, Private Alejo was injured in his left hand by a hand grenade during an alert. He says he pulled the pin out of the grenade to throw it to the enemy. The grenade fell into a foxhole. When he tried to pick it up again, he was injured by the explosion. So this guy, his grenade falls in a foxhole, and instead of leaving it there, he goes and tries to pick it up with his left hand. This obviously is extremely suspicious. What's also neat is you see that at the time they thought that having a hand blown off was not a serious condition. Now, December 23rd at 2:58. Private David, Company Al, was wounded on his right hand, apparently by a hand grenade explosion. The only person that can give details about this incident is the wounded man, as nobody knows how it happened. So you see there's been this series of highly suspicious accidents, and now it looks like they're catching on. They're saying like nobody witnessed this incident, so they're getting suspicious. And then later on, there's another message. It says that this wounded man, he was on guard duty and he saw a blue light approaching and later heard an explosion in front of the lights. He tried to throw a hand grenade and it exploded in his hand. And then the medical team writes over, traumatic amputation left hand caused by a blast of hand grenade. So I hope this guy was left-handed because he was trying to throw the grenade with his left hand according to what they're saying. Now we continue, December 25th at 9:15. Company L reports that Private Ramos suffered injuries from a hand grenade which blew off his left hand, blowing off 4 fingers. This happened while the man was holding a fragmentation grenade in his left hand and the safety pin with his right hand. He then slipped and the grenade went off, as explained by Lieutenant Urrutia. The man is being sent to the dispensary. There are no witnesses to this action. Colonel Cordero ordered an investigation to be made of this incident. Okay, so finally, we have 8 suspicious incidents in a period of 6 days. And finally, the commanding officer of the 3rd Battalion is asking for an investigation to be made. And once again, in this case, you see the guy says he wanted to throw a grenade, but for some reason he's holding it in his left hand, you know, kind of strange. So the question is, what was going on? What was going on? Now, I spoke to quite a few American veterans who were in this area of Peira Cava and who were in neighboring units. And what they basically all told me, they told me that these Puerto Rican guys, see, they come from a tropical island and they're sent to their first combat assignment in December in the French Alps when it's freezing cold. And what they said is that these guys were miserable. They were miserable, see. And plus, I suspect quite a few of these guys were very religious, and you see all these accidents happen just a few days before Christmas, so that probably also might have had a role. And this is a picture of the guy just in the snow, and we'll just take a closer look at the helmet. I'm not sure about this, but you see there seems to be something carved in the paint. It looks like this guy might also have carved a Malta cross in his helmet. But let's get back to our incidents. So the other American soldiers said these Puerto Ricans were really miserable, and here's a couple of accounts from Americans that I managed to find. So this guy here, he says that they were stationed in a village nearby, and one morning they received a call from the 65th Infantry saying that one of their observation posts had called in, obviously very agitated, and stated that they were in terrible conditions and demanded to talk to President Roosevelt immediately. So this guy went up to the Puerto Ricans and he found that they were lying directly on the ground in the snow with their sleeping bags, and obviously they were miserable. So they helped them install a dugout and something like that, so they'd be more comfortable. This is another American witness account. So he was in position at the time the Japanese guys were there. Then he says, then, to our consternation, the Nisai were replaced in our area by troops of the 65th Infantry Regiment, comprising troops from Puerto Rico. The new troops lacked the fighting spirit that characterized the fine warriors they replaced, and many were overwhelmed by the severity of winter conditions in the Alps. After the confidence and pride we had felt in working with the Nisai, there was a notable change in our feelings as we adjusted to working with the new troops. And then he was a witness of one of these so-called accidents. He says he was speaking to some of the Puerto Rican guards one night, and they had seen a jeep drive by with a wounded guy inside who had shot himself. And then he says that they heard a gunshot, and we quickly learned that they were the same infantry guards we had talked with only a short while earlier, and that one of them had shot himself through the hand and was in a state of shock. When we got them to the aid station, I had a look at the man's hand. It had been blasted apart by the force of a .30 caliber slug, erupting bones and flesh through the back of the hand beyond any hope of repair. An appalling wound and a shameful scar to carry through life. Evidence of a terrible fear overriding all considerations of pain or disgrace. His action was a punishable offense for cowardice, but most immediately important for him was the assurance that his combat days were over. I learned from the medic that the man we brought was the fourth already that night. Now, what is Colonel Ford thinking of all this? We read his first letter where he was extremely happy about being in the front lines with the Puerto Rican unit, and now what does he say? He writes a new letter on December 30th, 2 weeks later. I have a major operation and personnel shake-up to be performed. I called in all my officers today. That is, all I could safely take out of positions, and laid down the law. Last night I relieved my second in command and sent him to the brigade commander with a letter to the effect that I never again wanted to see him. It will cause some surprises in view of the fact that my predecessor recommended him to take command. I gather that, as usual, I am regarded as a very mean old I do not mind that in the slightest, but I hate to think of the long, hard job I have to do. It is difficult to change people's way of thought and to lift them bodily out of a really deep rut. So you can see that in 2 weeks, Colonel Ford is now very discontent with his unit, and he sees he's going to have a lot of work to do. And he mentions his getting rid of his second in command. So the second in command, as far as I know, was the commander of the 3rd Battalion of the 65th. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Cordero. And there's an account by one of the soldiers, Benjamin Vega, that mentions the relations between Cordero and Ford. This is an account that, these are notes from an interview that Noemi Figueroa, a historian of the 65th, made. So there's not the full interview, but luckily she did take notes. So Benjamin Vega remembers that Colonel Ford was a strict professional soldier. One time when they were at Peira Cava in an empty warehouse, Cordero, who was the commander of the 3rd Battalion, when it was in his underwear, face down on a cot, taking a nap. Ford passed by, spanked Cordero, and gave him an order. Cordero relayed the order to a major, the major went down the line, and eventually it ended up with a corporal. Ford passed by again and saw Cordero still sleeping on the cot, so he overturned the cot and started yelling at him. Cordero did not speak English well, and he used to pass the buck a lot. This is Benjamin Vega, was not impressed with Cordero as a leader. And when you look into Cordero's history some more, you see that he was also involved in the Korean War with the 65th Infantry, and he was relieved of his command in Korea. So Ford wanted to relieve him of his command after just 2 weeks in combat, and then in Korea you see it says, Kendall recommended the relief of Cordero, whom the general adjudged incapable of properly commanding a regiment of infantry in combat. Kendall described a colonel who was nervous and incoherent and utterly futile in judgment. And he even mentions that in Korea, Cordero earned the nickname Cordero the Butcher. So I guess that would be Cordero el Carnicero in Spanish. So probably not the kind of commanding officer you would like to have. So what happened after all this? Well, Colonel Ford doesn't say anything more. We'll see why. But what we see is 4 days after he wrote his letter, his angry letter we just saw, this is what happens. The commanding officer, so Colonel Ford, left with a patrol of the Regimental Intelligence and Reconnaissance platoon for the vicinity of the cable house near Fort La Forca to make a reconnaissance. Weather 5 degrees below zero, cold and foggy, visibility fair. So now you have a regimental commander, a colonel, going forward on a patrol to the German lines. Something completely abnormal. What's the reason for this? Well, you saw how unhappy he was, and he said we were going to have to do a lot of work. My guess is that he may have figured, like, I'm going to actually personally show these guys how it's done by going on a patrol myself. Another thing that I heard is that Ford apparently didn't believe the reports that the patrols were giving him, so he wanted to go on a patrol himself and make sure that they were actually going towards the German lines as they claimed. This is the terrain that the patrol had to cross, like we saw before, so they're going to go down one side into the valley and then up the other side to the German positions. This is the actual location where the patrol went, to this place that they called the Cable House. And what happened during the patrol? Well, this is what the period reports say. Sergeant Hurtado arrived from mission and informed that Colonel Ford, member of the patrol, was wounded and missing, probably killed, as the patrol had been attacked and outnumbered by the enemy. Results: 2 killed and 3 wounded. And then they say that they're waiting for confirmation of this report by Captain D.B. Logan, who's expected to give more detailed information. So D.B. Logan was in the artillery, and as far as I understand, he was a member of the patrol as a forward observer. So they did a big investigation afterwards to find out what had happened, and two people wrote first-hand accounts, I guess the 2 ranking people who were there. The first one is Sergeant Robles of the 65th Infantry. And he says, so they got up the mountain near where the German positions were, and this is what he describes. When we got to the rifle pit, Colonel Ford gave a signal to stop, which I did. He walked up to me and told me that we were close to the enemy positions. I continued with my patrol to the left of the ridge. He also told me that he would continue to the right with Captain Logan behind. I warned the colonel twice that he was exposed. I told that to the colonel because I have been there before, and he grinned. Then I continued with my patrol to the position that he told me to take. He kept going with Captain Logan until he reached to a place about 25 yards from the cable house. I could see the colonel standing up, observing through field glasses. So if you read through the lines here, the impression you get is that the soldiers are kind of looking in disbelief at what's happening. See, they're going very near the German positions, probably for no good reason. The colonel is exposed, and when he's told that he's exposed, instead of taking action, he smiles, he grins. So this is probably the colonel's first real patrol. And the impression we get is that he's really lacking experience, and that nobody dares say anything to him, though, because he's the colonel, right? So the colonel goes towards the German position, the cable house, and he looks at them with field glasses. This is what the cable house looks like, by the way. This is the area where the Americans came up, and the Germans were in this cable house. This is the cable house nowadays. It still has lots of holes in the wall from artillery fire. So Colonel Ford was looking at the cable house, and now the second witness comes in, so Captain Logan from the artillery. He says, there was a double tree. I put my rifle between the tree and put it to my shoulder, aiming at the house. The colonel stepped out from behind the tree to the left and advanced in the direction of the house. He took about 3 or 4 steps, slightly crouching, when there was one single shot fired from the direction of the cable house. After the shot, I heard the colonel's carbine hit the ground. I looked in his direction and saw him lying down on the ground on his back, in the axis of his movement, his head towards the cable house. I asked the colonel, "Where were you hit, Colonel?" He replied, "Logan, I'm hit in the back." Right after he said that, he drew his knees up and stretched out and quivered. I could see blood was flowing from his mouth. After that, I called at the colonel, "Colonel, come to me," and there was no answer. I remained in my position about a minute, and before I left, I took another look at him, and he looked to me like he was dead. So the colonel advanced towards the house and, not very surprisingly, got shot. And now the Logan went back. He told the sergeant to try to retrieve the body. In the meantime, more Germans came. An enlisted man, Aristides Calles, was shot and killed. 3 of the Puerto Rican soldiers were wounded. The sergeant who went to get the body didn't manage to see the body. He was fired at by the Germans. So the whole patrol just retreated and left the colonel's body where he had died within a few meters of the German positions. Now, what are the consequences of this, you see? So, as we said, the colonel is missing, 1 soldier is killed and 3 are wounded. And Lieutenant Colonel Cordero, who was supposed to be fired, now he's in command of the regiment because the colonel is dead or missing. And another patrol went to the area, a rescue patrol, but they were fired at by the Germans. They also couldn't find the body. They could do nothing, so they also came back. So what are the conclusions of all this, you know? We don't have many documents, but one document that does still exist is a letter that Colonel Ford's father-in-law, called Kurt von Seydlitz, wrote to the US Army. And this is what he says. Since I wrote you in September, I have heard a number of stories supposed to be circulating among the 65th Infantry Regiment and friends of the Colonel. Colonel Ford, taking over the command of the 65th, met with considerable difficulties to get discipline and combat abilities in the regiment. Colonel Ford, commander of the regiment, led personally a patrol of 1 officer and 12 men. I understand, actually, 2 battalions were under his command with the 6th Army and the 1st Battalion with the 7th Army. Would this not suggest that there was something not normal in his action? Colonel Ford was wounded through a shot in the back and ordered the patrol to return and leave him as he was done for, bleeding from the mouth. He was not dead at this moment. The officer and 11 men, 1 man wounded, leave the colonel dying on the top of the Maritime Alps in January and an easy prey to the enemy. 1 man of the returning patrol observed from a tree the taking of the colonel's body by the enemy pillbox. This apparently caused the report, missing in action, on January 4th, 1945. The story is told that Colonel Ford was shot by 1 of the men of the patrol. Over 1 year has passed by and not a word from the Quartermaster General, Grave Registration Section, Washington, D.C. regarding the body and personal effects has reached me or Mrs. Ford. In your letter of the 21st, you promised that she would be promptly notified. If the body of Colonel Ford can be found, an examination of the body will undoubtedly certify the fact if there is any truth in the story of his being shot by 1 of the men of his patrol. With this letter from the father-in-law, you see that there's a bunch of rumors going around, and that one of the rumors is that Colonel Ford was actually shot in the back by 1 of his own men during the patrol. And what happened to the body, and what happened when they found it and examined it? So Colonel Ford's body was found almost 1 year later, in September 1945, several months after the war was finished. They found it in the area where he was killed, in the German positions, and the Germans had buried him and put a cross on his grave. And regarding the cause of death, the people who exhumed the body probably had no idea about this controversy, so they probably just looked at it like any other body, and they wrote that they were unable to determine the cause of death because the body would have been, severely decomposed by then, and you would need an expert anthropologist or forensic pathologist to be able to say anything from looking at the body. These graves registration guys didn't have the training for that kind of thing. So let's summarize all the information we have. Was Colonel Ford killed in action, or was he shot by his own men? So what are the facts? The facts is that his body was recovered by the Germans and buried in the German positions, which is proof that he did die very near the German lines. On the patrol, he was not the only person to be killed. See, another soldier was also killed, and 3 soldiers were wounded. So that proves that there really was a firefight with the Germans. There wasn't just one guy who shot somebody in the back. And on the patrol there was another US officer, the Captain Logan, and he was not Puerto Rican, he was not from the 65th, he was an independent guy from an artillery unit, so he didn't know the people well, and he would have no reason to lie, let's say, and he says that he saw Colonel Ford being shot from the German lines. So yeah, and then what do we have in the opposite direction? We have the fact that Ford said that he was hit in the back. And then we have this kind of strange circumstances that Ford wanted to get rid of Cordero, the second in command, and then a couple of days later, he's killed. And then Cordero becomes the commander. So that circumstance is could lead to some, let's say, conspiracy ideas. So what's my opinion, you see, is that all the stronger evidence we have shows that Colonel Ford actually died at the German lines during a firefight with the Germans. And of course the circumstances of his death could lead to some rumors, but rumors, are not facts. So my personal opinion is that he was simply killed in action during a foolhardy patrol that he had organized himself. And you can wonder about what's this thing of being shot in the back, Well, there's two explanations, I think, for that. One thing is that when somebody is shot with a rifle from close up, like the case is here, the bullet usually goes in and out. So if he was shot, let's say, in the chest, and the bullet came in from in front and went out by behind, maybe he would feel pain in the front more, maybe in the back more, who knows, because there's actually a hole in the front and in the back. That's one thing. The other thing is that when people get shot, sometimes they have a split second to see that they're going to get shot. And they have time as a reflex to turn around, and then they end up getting shot in the back, even though they were actually facing the shooter, just instance before. So those are two explanations that I could see why he said he was shot in the back. Now, Colonel Ford, you see, we saw in this presentation that he wasn't experienced in combat. He had a kind of slightly childish approach to this, like he's being sent to a war zone and he's overjoyed to be sent to a war zone. And he leads this patrol that he should never have gone on as a regimental commander. And he does it in a way that's quite obviously irresponsible and foolhardy. And as a consequence, he's killed, one of his men is killed, and several men are wounded. But I still feel, I feel for this guy. He was trying to do his duty. He was trying to get a unit into shape. He was killed in the front lines, leading his men into action. He was a brave man. And he also had children, He had a wife, and he had... in one of the last letters he sent, he had wished them a Merry Christmas, and then a few days later he was killed in action. And, he said, all I risk is bumping my head against the cloud, and unfortunately, he probably did bump his head against the clouds a few times, as you can see in this picture. But in the end, he bumped into a German sniper's bullet, was shot and killed in the snow, abandoned, picked up by enemy troops, buried in a shallow grave, and missing in action for almost 1 year before he was found again. So his story is also quite tragic. So all this came to light thanks to finding this helmet near Peira Cava. So this is another soldier that comes out of obscurity. And of course what I said in this presentation doesn't necessarily reflect very nicely on the 65th Infantry Regiment, all these self-inflicted wounds and stuff, and Cordero being relieved of command. But it's not because 8 guys shot themselves in the hand that everybody, were cowards. These guys were from a tropical island. Whoever had the idea of sending them into the French Alps without any special training and stuff, that was not a good idea. They were given a new commanding officer when they were already on the front lines. All this seems to have been very poorly organized, and these guys were far from home and fighting a war that wasn't really their war. So most of them did their duty, the vast majority of them. They held the positions like they were told. In the end, in total, 12 men were killed. So mostly by mines and artillery. Also quite a few accidents happened. But, you know, they were there. And for World War II standards, having 12 killed in a battalion over a 2-month period isn't too much. But, you know, if you look at these losses nowadays, those would be considered heavy losses for a unit in a 2-month period. So I'd like to pay homage to these Puerto Rican guys who came to France and got killed here. Now to conclude, this story is written in my book. So if you want to know more, if Southern France interests you, well, you can always take a look at my book. And I'd also like to thank Noemia Figueroa Sule, who's a historian of the 65th. She also wrote a book about them, and she's always been extremely helpful with the research. So thank you, Noemi. And I can be contacted at this address for people who would like a hand or some advice regarding World War II research. So have a nice day, and see you in a next episode.